Lieutenant Richard Halsey, Best, stood in the cockpit of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 13,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, watching 3 Japanese aircraft carriers steam below him in precise formation. It was 10:22 in the morning on June 4, 1942. Best commanded Bombing Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise. He had just made a decision that violated every principle of dive bombing doctrine taught at Pensacola, every tactical guideline published in the Navy's training manuals, every sensible instinct about self-preservation that kept pilots alive. He was going to attack alone, not alone in the sense that his 2 wingmen weren't following him, they were, though reluctantly. Alone in the tactical sense that matters in naval aviation. The standard doctrine called for massed attacks. Concentrate your bombers. Overwhelm the defenses. Divide the enemy's attention across multiple targets so that some bombs would get through even if individual aircraft were shot down. Best was about to do the opposite. He was taking his tiny 3-plane section against a single carrier, the Akagi, while the rest of his squadron attacked a different ship. He was dividing his force in the face of the enemy, committing what every tactical manual identified as a fundamental error. The decision had been made in seconds, improvised in the chaos of a battle that was already dissolving into confusion. But it would determine the outcome of the most important naval engagement in the Pacific War. In approximately 4 minutes, that carrier below him would be transformed from the most powerful warship in the Japanese fleet into a blazing wreck that would burn for hours before her crew abandoned her to sink beneath the waves. The man who made it happen was not following orders. He was not executing a carefully planned strike. He was making it up as he went, trusting his judgment over doctrine, betting everything on a tactical improvisation that his superiors would later struggle to explain in their after-action reports. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is not a story about a perfect attack executed flawlessly according to plan. This is a story about how doctrine breaks down in combat, how individual decisions made in seconds can change the course of history, and how the pilot, who arguably did more than any other single man to win the Battle of Midway, spent the rest of his life grappling with what he had done and what it had cost him. The irony is profound. The attack that sank the Akagi, the flagship that had led the strike on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was executed in a manner that contradicted the very principles that had made American naval aviation effective. It succeeded not because it followed the rules, but because one pilot recognized in an instant that the rules no longer applied to the situation he faced. To understand why Best made the decision he did, why it worked, and why it mattered, you have to understand what American dive bomber pilots believed about their aircraft, their tactics, and their chances of survival in the spring of 1942. You have to understand what they had been taught, what they had practiced, and what 6 months of war in the Pacific had already taught them about the difference between peacetime doctrine and combat reality. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not a glamorous aircraft. Navy fighter pilots flew the sleek Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Army Air Force's pilots flew the heavy, powerful B-17 Flying Fortress or the nimble P-40 Warhawk. Dive bomber pilots flew what looked like a delivery truck with wings. The SBD was slow, with a maximum speed of 250 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. It was vulnerable, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks in early models and carrying armor protection that was minimal by the standards of 1942. It carried a crew of 2, pilot and rear gunner, crammed into a cockpit that offered excellent visibility but no comfort whatsoever on flights that could last 4 or 5 hours. But the SBD had one crucial capability that made it the most effective anti-ship weapon in the U.S. Navy's arsenal. It could deliver a 1,000-pound bomb with extraordinary accuracy, The technique was terrifying, physically punishing, and required a level of skill and nerve that sorted pilots into those who could do it and those who could not. The pilot would approach the target at altitude, typically between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, flying straight and level to avoid alerting the enemy to the attack. At the attack point, he would roll inverted, pull the nose down past vertical, and dive at an angle between 70 and 80 degrees. The aircraft would accelerate rapidly, reaching speeds exceeding 250 knots. The pilot would aim using a telescopic sight mounted in the cockpit, adjusting his dive angle to keep the target centered. At approximately 1,500 feet, he would release the bomb, then immediately pull out of the dive, subjecting himself and his gunner to forces exceeding 5 times the force of gravity. The physical demands were brutal. Pilots blacked out if they pulled too hard. They crashed into the ocean if they pulled too gently. The bomb itself was fitted with a 5-second delay fuse, meaning it would penetrate the target's deck before exploding internally, maximizing damage. But this required releasing at very low altitude, well within the range of every anti-aircraft weapon the enemy possessed. Japanese carriers bristled with defensive armament: 25mm automatic cannons, 13mm machine guns, and the devastating accuracy of Japanese gunners who had trained for years. A dive bomber making its attack run was committed. It could not maneuver evasively during the dive, without ruining its aim. It had to fly straight down into a cone of fire that grew denser and more accurate with every foot of altitude it lost. The doctrine that governed American dive bomber tactics in 1942 was built around one central principle: mass. Attack with as many aircraft as possible, simultaneously if you could coordinate it. A Japanese carrier could defend against 2 or 3 dive bombers with concentrated fire, shooting them down or forcing them to release early and miss. But if 12 bombers attacked at once, arriving from multiple angles, the defenses would be overwhelmed. Some aircraft would be shot down, some would miss. But the sheer volume of bombs falling would ensure hits. This was not theory. It was based on extensive peacetime exercises and the early experience of combat operations in the Coral Sea the previous month. By June of 1942, the United States had been at war for exactly 6 months. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet's battleship force, but it had missed the aircraft carriers. Those carriers, along with their escorting cruisers and destroyers, represented America's only offensive capability in the Pacific. They had struck back at Japanese positions across the Central Pacific in a series of raids designed more to boost American morale than to inflict serious damage. But in May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, carrier aircraft had fought the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other. The battle was tactically indecisive but strategically significant. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. The Americans lost the fleet carrier Lexington and suffered damage to the Yorktown. More importantly, both sides learned that carrier warfare was vastly more complex and chaotic than peacetime exercises had suggested. Coordinating attacks across multiple squadrons was nearly impossible. Fighter cover was essential, but difficult to position correctly. Navigation over the open ocean was challenging, and finding enemy carriers required either exceptional reconnaissance or extraordinary luck. Attacks that looked devastating in practice, massed formations of dive bombers and torpedo bombers, covered by fighters, converging on the target, simultaneously dissolved into confusion in combat. Squadrons became separated. Fighters lost track of the bombers they were supposed to protect. Bombers arrived at different times, allowing the enemy to concentrate defensive fire on one group at a time. The American dive bomber pilots who flew at Coral Sea learned these lessons the hard way. They also learned that when they did hit a Japanese carrier, the results were catastrophic. The Shoho absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits and sank in minutes. Japanese carriers, despite their formidable defenses and excellent damage control training, proved vulnerable to the same weakness that plagued all carriers. They were floating fuel depots filled with aviation, gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes. One well-placed bomb could start fires that quickly became uncontrollable. By early June, American intelligence had determined that the Japanese were planning a major operation. Cryptanalysts working in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to identify the target. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Japanese were committing their main carrier striking force, 4 fleet carriers, that represented the most powerful naval aviation force in the world. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same carriers that had destroyed the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean in April, the same carriers whose aircraft had sunk the American carriers Lexington at Coral Sea and would have sunk Yorktown as well, if not for SO's extraordinary damage control efforts that got her back to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, committed everything he had. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter rushed back into service after 72 hours of emergency repairs that would have taken 3 months under peacetime conditions. Against the Japanese 4 carriers with their highly trained, combat-experienced air crews, the Americans would have to achieve surprise, concentrate their forces, and execute their attacks with precision. The pilots knew the odds. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the Japanese were better trained, more experienced, and flying from more carriers with more aircraft. What they did not know, what no one could know until the morning of June 4th, was how completely Doctrine would fail them when it mattered most. Richard Best had learned to fly dive bombers in 1938 at Naval Air Station Pensacola. The training was systematic, progressive, and built around the assumption that pilots would have time to master each skill before moving to the next. Students began with basic aerobatics, learning to control their aircraft through rolls, loops, and spins. They progressed to gunnery, firing at towed targets to develop the hand-eye coordination necessary for aerial combat. Only after mastering these fundamentals did they move to dive bombing. The technique was taught in stages. First, shallow dives at 30 degrees, releasing practice bombs at 3,000 feet. Then steeper dives at 45 degrees, releasing at 2,000 feet. Finally, the full 70-degree dive, the attack profile that would become standard for the SBD Dauntless, releasing at 1,500 feet. Instructors emphasized smoothness. Don't jerk the controls. Don't overcompensate. Keep the target centered in your sight. Count to yourself during the dive, 1001, 1002, to judge altitude without fixating, on your instruments. Pull out smoothly but firmly, accepting the G-forces but not forcing them beyond what you and your aircraft could sustain. By the time Best graduated and received his assignment to Bombing Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise, he had performed hundreds of practice dives. He had dropped practice bombs on targets in the Gulf of Mexico until he could put them within 50 feet of the aim point consistently. He had learned the SBD's characteristics intimately, how it handled at different speeds and altitudes, how much rudder to apply during the dive to compensate for engine torque, how to judge the exact moment to release so the bomb would arc downward into the target rather than being thrown forward by the aircraft's momentum. But peacetime training could not replicate combat conditions. Practice targets did not shoot back. Practice dives were flown against stationary markers painted on the water, not against ships maneuvering evasively at 30 knots. Practice. Missions were flown in good weather, with clear visibility, with instructors available by radio to provide guidance. And practice missions never ever involved the kind of navigation challenges that would face dive bomber pilots in combat over the open Pacific, where finding your target and finding your way home were often more difficult than the attack itself. Best had his first taste of combat reality during the early carrier raids in the first months of 1942. In February, Enterprise aircraft struck Japanese installations on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Best led his squadron against shipping in the lagoon. The experience was instructive. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was far more intense and accurate than anything he had encountered in training. The smoke and confusion made it difficult to assess results. Several aircraft were damaged. One was shot down. But the squadron had attacked together, overwhelming the defences through sheer numbers, and had achieved significant hits. At the Coral Sea in May, Best's squadron had been assigned to attack the carrier Shoho. The attack was textbook multiple squadrons converging simultaneously, dive bombers and torpedo bombers coordinating their runs to divide the Japanese defences. The Shoho absorbed so many hits that she sank in less than 30 minutes. The squadron lost no aircraft in the attack. The Doctrine had worked exactly as planned. But the Battle of the Coral Sea had also revealed how difficult it was to coordinate large formations over long distances. Some squadrons had failed to find the enemy entirely. Others had arrived piecemeal, attacking in small groups that the Japanese defences could concentrate against. Radio communication between squadrons was unreliable. Navigation was challenging, with several squadrons becoming lost and running dangerously low on fuel before finding their way back to their carriers. The chaos and confusion of combat bore little resemblance to the orderly exercises conducted in peacetime. Best understood these lessons. He understood that Doctrine provided a framework, not a script. He understood that combat required improvisation, that no plan survived contact with the enemy, that pilots had to make decisions based on what they observed rather than what they expected. But he also believed in the fundamental principle that had been drilled into him throughout his training: attack in force, concentrate your bombers, overwhelm the defences through mass. That principle had worked at Kwajalein. It had worked at Coral Sea. It was the foundation of American dive bomber tactics. On the morning of June 4, 1942, that principle would be tested in circumstances that no one had anticipated and no training had prepared anyone to handle. The test would come not in the form of stronger defences or more accurate anti-aircraft fire, but in the form of a simple, brutal problem. What do you do when you arrive over the target, discover that someone else is already attacking the carriers you were supposed to hit? The American strike force had launched from Enterprise and Hornet in the early morning darkness, approximately 230 miles from the estimated position of the Japanese carriers. The plan called for coordinated attacks by dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters from both carriers, converging on the enemy simultaneously. The torpedo bombers would attack low, forcing the Japanese combat air patrol down to defend. The dive bombers would attack from high altitude, while the fighters were engaged at low level. The fighters would provide cover, engaging the Japanese Zeros that would try to intercept the bombers. The plan fell apart almost immediately. The torpedo squadrons, flying slower aircraft at low altitude, became separated from the dive bombers. The fighters, assigned to escort the torpedo planes, lost contact with the bombers they were supposed to protect. Navigation errors and the topaz movement of the Japanese fleet meant that different squadrons arrived over the target area at different times. The torpedo squadrons from Hornet arrived first, without fighter cover, and were slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost all 15 of its aircraft. Only one man survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. The attacks achieved nothing. Every torpedo missed or failed to detonate. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something crucial, though unintended. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. And they had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver evasively, breaking their formation and creating confusion in the Japanese fleet. When the American dive bombers finally arrived, they found the Japanese carriers in the worst possible situation. Their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, their fighters at low altitude chasing the last of the torpedo bombers, their formation disrupted and their attention focused entirely on the threat from below. Best led Bombing Squadron 6 to the attack point at approximately 10:20 in the morning. Below him, he could see 3 carriers later identified as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sailing in a rough line. He could also see dive bombers from Yorktown's bombing squadron, 3 already in their dives, attacking the carrier on the left. This was not the plan. The plan had called for Enterprise's bombers to attack all 3 carriers simultaneously, with Yorktown's squadrons arriving later to deliver follow-up strikes. But someone had arrived early, or Enterprise had arrived late, and now the tactical situation demanded an immediate decision. Squadron doctrine was clear. The squadron commander would assign targets to each division before the attack. All aircraft would attack together, saturating the defences. Best's squadron had 33 aircraft divided into 4 divisions. The obvious move was to divide them among the 2 unattacked carriers, overwhelming both simultaneously. But Best could see that Yorktown's bombers were already hammering the leftmost carrier. He could see the bomb hits, see the fires starting, see the ship beginning to lose way. That carrier was finished, whether his bombers hit it or not. He made his decision in seconds. He would take his 3-plane section himself and his 2 wingmen, ensigns, Frederick Weber and Edwin Kroger, and attack the center carrier, the Akagi. The rest of the squadron, 30 aircraft under Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, would attack the rightmost carrier, the Kaga. It violated every principle of concentration of force. It meant dividing his squadron in the face of the enemy, sending 3 aircraft against one target and 30 against another. It meant his section would face the Akagi's defences alone, without the protection that numbers provided. Any instructor at Pensacola would have failed him for such a decision. In a training exercise, if you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Best rolled his aircraft inverted and pulled the nose down into a 70-degree dive. Weber and Kroger followed. The Akagi grew larger in his sight as he plummeted toward it at accelerating speed. The wind noise increased to a scream. The aircraft vibrated as it approached terminal velocity. The perforated dive brakes deployed from the wings, creating massive drag that kept the speed manageable and the dive stable. Best could see the carrier's deck clearly now, see the aircraft spotted on it, see the white wakes of its escorting ships, see the tracers from anti-aircraft fire beginning to reach toward him. The Japanese gunners on the Akagi were firing everything they had. 25mm automatic cannons pumped explosive shells into the sky. 13mm machine guns created streams of tracer fire. The barrels were aimed straight up, tracking the dive bombers as they fell. But the bombers were small targets, approaching head-on, presenting minimal cross-section. And they were falling fast, accelerating beyond 250 knots, covering the distance from attack altitude to release point in less than 30 seconds. Best centered the Akagi in his telescopic sight. The carrier was turning, trying to maneuver, its captain attempting to present the smallest possible target to the bombers diving on him. But a carrier turning at 30 knots still presents a massive target to a pilot looking straight down on it from 12,000 feet. Best could see every detail: the red meatball insignia on the deck, the island superstructure on the starboard side, the aircraft crowded forward and aft. He adjusted his dive angle slightly, compensating for wind and the carrier's movement, keeping the ship centered. At 1,500 feet, he released. The 1,000-pound bomb separated, cleanly from the aircraft's centerline rack, its momentum carrying it forward and down. Best immediately pulled back on the stick, hard. The aircraft curved out of its dive, G forces crushing him into his seat. His vision narrowed, greyed at the edges. The G suit he wore inflated, squeezing his legs and abdomen to keep blood from pooling away from his brain. He held the pull, watching the altimeter, maintaining back pressure until the aircraft leveled off at 500 feet, streaking away from the carrier at maximum speed. Behind him, Weber and Kroger followed the same procedure. 3 bombs fell toward the Akagi in the space of perhaps 20 seconds. Best, already pulling away, couldn't see the impacts. His rear gunner, aviation radioman First Class James Murray, watched through the rear-facing window. He saw the first bomb, Best's bomb, strike the Akagi just aft of the midship elevator. The 5-second delay fuse functioned perfectly. The bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck, penetrated the hangar deck below, and detonated inside the ship among the aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The explosion was catastrophic. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly. Bombs and torpedoes stacked on carts throughout the hangar deck detonated in sympathetic explosions. The hangar deck, designed to be an open space for aircraft maintenance, became a blast furnace. Flames roared through the ship. The wooden flight deck above buckled and warped from the heat. Aircraft spotted on deck caught fire. The fire spread to the bridge structure, to the engine room ventilators, to every open hatch and passageway. Weber's bomb hit seconds later, striking near the forward elevator. The result was the same penetration, delay, internal detonation, catastrophic fire. Kroger's bomb, the third and final weapon from Best's section, struck near the stern. 3 bombs, 3 hits, 3 internal explosions in the space of approximately 20 seconds. The Akagi's damage control parties, trained and experienced, fought to contain the fires. They might have succeeded if the ship had taken only 1 hit, perhaps even 2. But 3 internal explosions, each igniting fuel and ordnance, created fires that spread faster than damage control teams could respond. At the same time, 30 dive bombers from Lieutenant Gallagher's group struck the cargo. The result was similar: multiple hits, internal explosions, catastrophic fires. The Yorktown bombers, whose attack Best had observed beginning as he started his own dive, had achieved at least 3 hits on the Soryu. In the span of approximately 6 minutes, all 3 Japanese carriers had been transformed from powerful striking platforms into burning wrecks. Best pulled away from the Akagi at wavetop level, jinked left and right to spoil the aim of Japanese destroyers firing at him, then climbed back to altitude for the long flight back to the Enterprise. Murray, in the rear seat, reported that the carrier was burning heavily, that he could see secondary explosions continuing, that the ship had lost way and was dead in the water. Best acknowledged the report, but said nothing. He was already thinking about the return flight, about fuel consumption, about whether they had enough gas to make it back to the carrier. The Akagi burned for hours. Japanese damage control teams fought desperately, but the fires were beyond control. At 7:15 that evening, with fires still raging throughout the ship, Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered abandon ship. Destroyers came alongside to take off survivors. The carrier was scuttled the following morning by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers, her hull finally slipping beneath the waves after burning through the night. The Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates, both abandoned and scuttled after fires made them uninhabitable. A 4th carrier, the Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that damaged the Yorktown before being found and destroyed by American bombers that afternoon. The Battle of Midway was effectively over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and their highly trained aircrew losses that would never be replaced. The United States had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, which survived the Japanese attack but was sunk by a submarine while under tow. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Japan would never again possess the offensive capability it had wielded for the first 6 months of the war. Richard Best flew 1 more combat mission after Midway. On June 24, 1942, 20 days after the battle, he participated in a strike against Japanese shipping in the Aleutian Islands. During the flight, he became violently ill. His lungs burned. He coughed uncontrollably. By the time he returned to the Enterprise, he was coughing up blood. The ship's medical officer examined him and delivered a diagnosis that ended Best's combat career. Acute tuberculosis, both lungs extensively damaged. The cause was not disease, exposure, or bad luck. It was equipment failure. The oxygen system in Best's SBD had malfunctioned during the Midway attack, allowing caustic soda lime used in the oxygen generation system to absorb carbon dioxide to contaminate the oxygen supply. Best had inhaled caustic soda fumes for over 4 hours during the mission. During the flight to the target, during the dive when he was breathing hard against the G-forces, and during the long return flight when fuel concerns required flying at higher altitude where oxygen was necessary. The fumes had chemically burned his lungs, creating permanent damage that would make him susceptible to tuberculosis infection. He was evacuated to the United States and spent the next 2 years in a naval hospital, undergoing treatment that by 1942 standards meant bed rest, fresh air, and hope that his immune system could contain the infection. He survived. The tuberculosis was eventually controlled, but his lungs never fully recovered. He was medically retired from the Navy in 1944 with a disability rating, having flown combat missions for less than 6 months of the war. Best spent the rest of his life. He died in 2001 at age 91, grappling with the strange mathematics of his service. He had flown one of the most consequential missions in American military history. His 3-plane section had sunk the Akagi, the flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. His decision to divide his squadron, violating tactical doctrine, had ensured that 3 Japanese carriers were struck nearly simultaneously, preventing any of them from launching counterstrikes while under attack. Naval historians would later argue that Best's attack was the single most important individual action at Midway, that his bombs, specifically dropped by his hand on that morning, had done more to change the course of the Pacific War than any other ordnance expended in the battle. But he had paid for it with his career and his health. And he had done it in a way that military doctrine said was wrong. The official after-action reports praised the squadron's achievement, but quietly noted the irregular tactics. Squadron commanders were not supposed to divide their forces. 3-plane sections were not supposed to attack fleet carriers alone. The fact that it had worked did not make it sound doctrine. Best had succeeded not because he followed his training, but because he recognized in a moment of chaos that the situation demanded improvisation. He gave few interviews about the battle. He attended squadron reunions and maintained friendships with other Midway veterans, but he was not comfortable with the hero worship that sometimes accompanied recognition of his role. He had done his job. He had made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The fact that they worked out, and that historians decades later would identify those decisions as crucial, did not change the reality of what it had felt. Like in the moment, confused, chaotic, uncertain, and afterward physically destroyed by equipment that was supposed to keep him alive. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. The citation mentioned his skill, courage, and devotion to duty. It did not mention that his tactical decision violated doctrine, because acknowledging that would have required explaining why doctrine had failed and why individual judgment had succeeded. It was easier to praise the outcome than to examine the process that had produced it. The Battle of Midway forced the United States Navy to confront uncomfortable truths about carrier aviation doctrine. The battle had been won, but not according to plan. The coordinated strike that was supposed to overwhelm Japanese defenses through simultaneous attacks by torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters had fallen apart completely. The squadrons had arrived piecemeal. The fighters had failed to protect the torpedo bombers. The dive bombers had attacked without knowing where the other squadrons were or what they were doing. And yet the dive bombers had achieved devastating success. The reason, analysts eventually concluded, was not superior doctrine or better training. It was luck and timing. The torpedo bombers, attacking first without fighter cover, had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude and forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver evasively. By the time the dive bombers arrived, the Japanese fighters were out of position and the carriers were vulnerable. If the timing had been different, if the dive bombers had arrived first, or if the Japanese had maintained better fighter coverage at high altitude, the outcome might have been very different. The Navy's response was to revise its doctrine, but not in the ways one might expect. The official training manuals continued to emphasize coordinated attacks and concentration of force, but they also began to emphasize flexibility and initiative, acknowledging that combat conditions would rarely match peacetime assumptions. Squadron commanders were given more latitude to adjust tactics based on observed conditions. Pilots were trained to make decisions independently when communications failed or situations changed. Best's decision to divide his squadron was studied extensively at the Naval War College. Some instructors used it as an example of how exceptional judgment could overcome doctrinal limitations. Others used it as an example of how even successful improvisation contained risks that commanders should avoid when possible. The debate was never fully resolved. Doctrine exists to provide structure and guidance, especially for average pilots in normal conditions. But exceptional circumstances sometimes require exceptional decisions that violate doctrine precisely because the circumstances are not normal. The larger lesson, which took years to fully absorb, was about the nature of carrier aviation itself. Coordinating attacks across multiple squadrons, flying different types of aircraft at different speeds and altitudes, was extraordinarily difficult. Radio communication was unreliable, navigation was challenging. The enemy was maneuvering, weather could change rapidly. The doctrine that looked perfect in peacetime exercises broke down in combat not because it was poorly designed, but because combat introduced variables that no exercise could replicate. By 1943, American carrier doctrine had evolved significantly. Strike groups were organized differently, with better communication equipment and more flexible command structures. Fighter coverage was improved through better radar and fighter director techniques. Torpedo bombers were eventually replaced by dive bombers carrying heavier bombs, eliminating the coordination problem between different aircraft types. And pilots were given more extensive training in navigation and communication, reducing the likelihood that squadrons would become separated during strikes. But the fundamental tension between doctrine and improvisation remained. Military organizations need doctrine to function effectively. Individual initiative is essential but cannot replace systematic training and planning. The Battle of Midway succeeded because individual pilots like Best made correct decisions in moments of chaos, but those decisions were only possible because the pilots had been thoroughly trained in the fundamentals. Best could improvise effectively because he understood doctrine well enough to know when to violate it. The Japanese faced a different problem after Midway. They had lost not just 4 carriers, but the trained air crews that had flown from those carriers. Japanese pilot training emphasized quality over quantity, producing small numbers of highly skilled aviators through lengthy, intensive programs. When those pilots were killed, they could not be quickly replaced. The United States, by contrast, expanded its training programs massively, producing thousands of competent pilots, even if they were not quite as skilled individually as their Japanese counterparts. By 1944, American carriers operated with air crews who were adequate rather than exceptional, but there were so many of them that quantity compensated for any individual deficiencies. The story of Richard Best's attack on the Akagi is not really a story about one pilot's courage or skill, though both were present. It is a story about the collision between doctrine and reality, between what military organizations teach and what combat demands. Best had been trained to attack in mass, to concentrate forces, to overwhelm defenses through numbers. He had practiced those tactics for years. He had used them successfully at Coral Sea, but on the morning of June 4, 1942, Doctrine failed to match the situation he encountered. Someone else was already attacking one carrier. Dividing his squadron between the two remaining carriers was the logical response, even though it violated fundamental tactical principles. The decision took seconds. The consequences lasted for years. The Akagi sank because Best put 3 bombs into her in the span of 20 seconds. The Pacific War's momentum shifted because those bombs ignited fires that destroyed Japan's offensive carrier capability. Best's lungs were destroyed because his oxygen system failed during a flight that should have been routine by combat standards. His career ended because one piece of equipment malfunctioned at precisely the wrong time. The irony is profound and multifaceted. The attack that violated Doctrine succeeded spectacularly. The pilot who made the crucial decision paid a higher price than most of the pilots who followed Doctrine and survived. The equipment that was supposed to keep him alive, his oxygen system, destroyed his health more effectively than any Japanese weapon. And the official records praised his achievement while quietly noting that his tactics were irregular, as if success could be celebrated without examining why conventional approaches had failed. Military historians studying Midway have debated for decades whether Best's decision was brilliant improvisation or dangerous deviation. The debate misses the point. The decision was both. It was brilliant because it worked. It was dangerous because it could easily have failed. In a battle where American forces were outnumbered and the outcome was uncertain, dividing forces in the face of the enemy was exactly the kind of tactical error that loses battles. The fact that it won this particular battle does not make it sound doctrine. What made Best's decision correct was not that it followed some superior tactical principle, but that it matched the specific circumstances he faced. Doctrine provides general guidance. Combat demands specific responses to specific situations. The distance between those two requirements, between the general and the specific, between the planned and the actual, is where battles are won or lost. Best succeeded because he could bridge that distance in seconds, making a decision that violated his training because the situation demanded it. The larger truth that Midway revealed, though it took years for the Navy to fully absorb it, was about the limits of planning in complex military operations. No plan survives contact with the enemy because the enemy is not a passive element in someone else's plan. The Japanese carriers at Midway were not floating targets waiting to be attacked. They were maneuvering, launching fighters, coordinating their own defenses, and attempting to strike back. The battle became a fluid, chaotic interaction between two forces, each trying to accomplish its objectives while preventing the other from accomplishing theirs. In that chaos, Doctrine provided a foundation but not a script. Best's training gave him the skills to dive bomb accurately, to navigate over open ocean, to manage his aircraft systems under stress. But his training could not tell him what to do when he arrived over the target and found the tactical situation completely different from what had been briefed. That decision, that specific choice in that specific moment, required judgment that transcended doctrine. He made the right choice. The Akagi burned and sank. The Japanese offensive capability was broken. The course of the Pacific War changed. And Best spent the next 2 years in a hospital bed, his lungs scarred by caustic soda fumes, his flying career over before his 23rd birthday, grappling with the knowledge that his moment of greatest achievement had cost him everything he had trained for years to do. When you stand at 13,000 feet above an enemy carrier, watching other aircraft already in their attack dives, facing a decision that must be made in seconds, doctrine becomes not a set of rules to follow but a foundation to build on. Best built on that foundation, improvised, when the situation demanded it, and changed history in 4 minutes of combat. The fact that it cost him his health and his career does not diminish the achievement. It simply adds another layer of irony to a story already rich with contradictions between theory and practice, between planning and execution, between what military organizations teach and what combat demands. That morning in June 1942, Doctrine said to attack in mass. Reality said that someone else was already attacking one target and time was running out. Best chose reality over doctrine. 3 bombs fell. 1 carrier died. The mathematics of war sometimes reduce to such brutal simplicity, even when the decisions that produce those results are anything but simple. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.